Hi, everybody. This is Tom. Before we get started, I want to apologize for an audio issue. Something changed in my laptop settings for the audio before we recorded this session. Made me sound as if I'm yelling into the microphone. I wasn't. I managed to clean up a lot of it in the mix, but I have to then say that my regrets that the audio quality, at least for me, is not as good as it has been in previous episodes, and I've certainly made some fixes to make sure that this issue doesn't pop up in future ones. All right, welcome to the latest episode of Ancient Geeks, a podcast where two geeks of a certain age talk about how we became geeks, what it was like to encounter different elements of geek culture for the first time, and how it all wove together in a mysterious and splendiferous way. I'm Tom Grant.
And I'm Stephen Taylor.
And today we're going to be talking Tolkien, and that's Tolkien for the purists out there. I got it right this time, didn't I?
John Ronald Reuel Tolkien,
yes.
As we understand the appropriate pronunciation.
John Roy Rogers Tolkien.
That's right. That's right.
All right.
Who set the precedent for all, I guess, all major fantasy authors to have R.R. in the middle of their name somewhere.
There we go. Yes.
It's just it's required.
Coincidence?
Anyway.
Yeah. All right. Before we get into that, we have a new segment. Just what have we been doing lately in terms of consumption or production of geek culture? So why don't you go first, Stephen? What have you been doing?
So I mean, I did for this podcast. I had not partaken at all of the Rings of Power, and I did watch the first episode because I just kind of wanted to get a sense of it, and we can discuss whether that's. I know you've watched more than I have, but that's toward the end of this thing. Probably the biggest thing of late is I watched and reviewed the Section 31 movie, which I was not that impressed with, to be kind. It was
that was the most politest commentary I've heard about that.
Very good. Movie. I mean, it could have been worse. But I did write up a lengthy review, which is available at OutsideTheBeltway.com, which where I write about politics mostly, but also it's linked from the Reddit page and probably some of other socials at this point, if anybody's interested in that. And then probably the only other thing that would fit into the culture that we're discussing, I have been reading some relatively recent DC comics, try to understand where they are these days. How about yourself, Tom?
Okay, so I reread The Hobbit for this episode, and I'll certainly be interspersing kind of my late in life reactions and contrasting them with my early in life reactions to The Hobbit when we get to the Tolkien section of this podcast. I was rereading some of the Burns Superman run, kind of inspired by our Superman episode, and also kind of got detoured into Animal Man, which I've really been enjoying. The run of that from the 90s, was it? The 80s?
Probably. I don't remember. I don't know that I ever have read it. I do remember it being there. I think, because now you tickled something in my head. I think probably why I didn't, because it made me think about that terrible TV show called Manimal. You remember Manimal?
Who could forget Simon McCorkindale as Manimal? That's just such a mouthful to say that.
That's something else. Yes. So I've never read Animal Man. Maybe I'll have to give it a look.
Yeah, let's see. We both saw the Fantastic Four trailer, obviously.
Yes, we did. We saw the trailer. I am intrigued by it. The Fantastic Four is one of my favorite comic properties. So and it's never been done right on film.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
Fingers crossed. It looks promising, the way that the Superman trailer looked really promising.
That's right.
Just embracing the comics for what they are.
That's right. And the promise that maybe Galactus is not a big white cloud. That's probably pretty good.
That seems pretty clear that he's not a big white cloud. Yes. So, hey, was it like the Parallax also a big cloud in the Green Lantern movie?
I think it was, now that you mention it.
Well, that wasn't a white cloud, but
I think it was a cloud. I think you're right.
Yeah. All right. So bad superhero movies convert the cosmic supervillains into
The
clouds
clouds.
because clouds are
Sure.
scary. You know, you just look
Clouds are scary.
outside and they're right there, looking down on you, judging you all the time. Well, so what else I've been doing? I rewatched the original Godzilla movie, apropos of nothing, but also connected to things that we've been doing lately. I watched some of the DC animation that's come out lately. I watched Monster
Yes.
Squad, and I tried watching the first episode of Harley Quinn. And I'll just say this: I think that there is a very short path between the upcoming Superman movie, which seems very hopeful,
Yes.
very core Superman in concept, and like the older, Justice League and Superman and Batman cartoons that came out in the 90s and 2000s. I wonder what the reaction would be if somebody said, "Hey, let's watch this very innocuous Superman movie," and then they wound up watching Monster Squad or Harley Quinn. That would be quite a
It is like
transition.
I have not watched Monster Squad. I've actually watched quite a bit of Harley Quinn. I actually like it, but it is a very specific taste. There is
Yes,
an
it's well.
episode.
Let's just be clear for the listeners. They're very profane and very violent.
Very prevent
Yeah.
to the point of grotesque at times. Especially the first one. It's been a while since I watched it. I seem to recall it's quite gory.
Hmm.
And yeah, it is a particular mood that they're trying to strike. Um, I There is an episode about this is again for I keep teasing future Batman discussions. There is an episode about Batman, and it's actually a pretty good commentary on the way the character has been treated or portrayed. I don't know.
Hmm.
It's really about his fixation on his parents' death. It's actually very good, but yeah, the show is it's definitely a dark comedy.
Yeah. So I wanted to mention that just for people who haven't been exploring the animation. If you want kind of straight superhero kinds of comics translated into an animated medium, there's tons of that. There are
Yes,
movies, there are shows like the Batman the animated series and so forth. But it's a different almost subgenre almost that you're
yes,
seeing with those.
absolutely.
Yeah, more like the Suicide Squad movie.
Hmm.
All right, and the last thing I wanted to talk about before we got on to the main subject for today was I rewatched the classic Star Trek episodes and The Children Shall Lead and
Yes,
the alternative factor because last time we said, well, we disagreed on which was the worst. You thought it was and The Children Shall Lead. I
yes.
thought it was the alternative factor.
And you still think it's the alternative
I
factor. And
I, I came back vindicated.
yeah. I was supposed to do homework on
Yeah.
this and I never
Don't
did
worry
it.
about it.
But
Don't
maybe
worry about it.
I'm saving myself 2 hours of a horror. But yeah,
Yeah, it's like that's not like saying I didn't stab myself with a pencil.
that's
You
fair.
know,
Yes.
you know,
I,
that's okay that you did not inflict that
I,
on yourself.
I didn't get any paper cuts and soaked them in lemon juice. So I guess it's probably for the best that I did not find the time to do that.
Yeah. Well, so here's my take on it. I thought that the Children Shall Leave was ineptly executed.
Yes.
It was really bad in a nutshell.
Yes.
TLDR, as the kids say, but it had an interesting premise. So the Enterprise races to this planet where the scientists and their families and the scientists are all dead, and the children are kind of dancing around, acting, you know, pretty clearly that they either don't understand that all of the adults are dead in kind of pretty horrific ways, like suicide and murder and so forth, but also, or maybe they just don't care. So it was I thought, it was one of the most horrific Star Trek episodes of any of the series, just at least from the get go. Um, the alternative factor, on the other hand, just everything, including the premise, was bad. So just the universe winking out and the dumb antimatter universe where it's only a problem if the person in the antimatter universe meets their exact duplicate in the matter universe, and then both universes die. I mean, everything about it, the premise, the science, the acting, the just like endless scenes of Lazarus gurning, while he's getting split between universes. Like why did anybody think those scenes were really interesting? Oh,
with
it
his
was just
crazy bandage.
with his crazy advantage and his crazy beard.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you even though I did not, stab my eyes with pencils to face this challenge, you do raise a good point, which is there was a premise in "And the Children Shall Lead" that might have been executed in a way that really was interesting, and the premise in the alternative factor is just silly. So
Yes.
I'll concede that perhaps, in fact, the alternative factor
Okay.
is the worst episode of TOS because you're right. It is the silly, trying to figure out which one he is. It never is clear why they're locked in this battle.
Yeah.
Um,
Why
in
he's
fact,
allowed to run loose on the Enterprise?
no, because as I recall, and again, I don't want to get too deep into this, but I feel like there was the two the Lazari, seemed to claim that the other was like evil, but all they seemed to be was just from different universes, and I don't know why they were
Yeah.
fighting. And I don't know
No.
really why the one from our universe would have even. None of you're right. In terms of making any sense whatsoever, that episode makes no sense. And as I recall, too, the beginning at the part at the beginning when the Starfleet guy shows up and makes a warning, it's like some kind of catastrophic thing's going to happen, it was all just bizarre. You're right. So that's a pretty sucky hour of television.
Yeah.
I don't know. Actually, when we stop and think about it, I win because I didn't watch it.
Oh
So
yes, I think you won, but that was a very gentlemanly admission that you made, and I appreciate it. Uh,
well, how
the
about we
things we
go?
do for our faithful listeners
That's
here.
right. That's right. So shall we go over the Misty Mountains Cold
Yes, we should.
to Dungeons Deep and Caverns Old?
Yes, let's
Um,
do it.
cool.
Okay, so if we had a musical intro for
Yes.
this, what would it be?
So that's a really good question. I think that two things do come to mind. There are some of this stuff that I had listened to there was a radio drama and there is a song of that song. I'm not going to sing it. God, we're trying to attract listeners, not chase them away. But that had that music to that song that sticks in
Mhm.
my head. But also, I mean, I have to admit the music from the Peter Jackson movie is,
Mhm.
pretty pretty substantial for if we're going for music.
Yeah,
Other sounds. Um,
I was thinking one of the very long Elven songs
oh well, yes, that's true.
that we have not committed to memory.
No, no, I
No,
was obsessed.
no.
Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, right? I was obsessed to a degree trying to figure out Elvish when I was, in seventh grade. But yeah, I don't remember.
Yeah.
I remember that Milan is friend. That's all that I remember right
Yeah,
now.
I got as far as like trying to do the writing, both
Oh yeah, I
the
tried to do the
Dwarvish and
writing.
the Elvish writing. I didn't get into the
Yes.
actual language itself.
Yeah, I had this bizarre misconception about language somewhere along. Actually, it's in elementary school. I think it really stayed into early middle school that it was like a code that
Mhm.
language wasn't like if whatever the word for blue in Spanish and Elvish, they would just all just learn the code, and if you learn the code, you can speak the language, and obviously
Right.
that's not how language works. But I didn't know that at the time. I was fascinated with. We had a multilingual dictionary that I would like. I had like five languages in it, and I would just love to like figure this out. But you're not learning Italian that way. Anyway,
No.
I digress.
Okay, so
So,
how did we find Tolkien? So how did you find Tolkien?
so Tolkien, Tolkien is as I really was thinking about this entire conversation, especially as it pertains to the podcast, is really one of my deepest first loves. If Star Trek is one of these deep first loves, Tolkien really is another one. And as I mentioned in our origin stories episode, I really first encountered Tolkien in the Bankin and Rass Hobbit movie that they put out, Rankin Bass, whatever. I
Yeah.
said the wrong thing, but no one noticed, and no one's gonna make fun of me. The Rankin and Bass movie that was on TV in the 1970s. It was in 1977, and then that rapidly led to me getting the book and reading the book multiple times, and then seeing the Bashki Lord of the Rings movie at a friend's house and being really struck by. I didn't. It was like on. We were like didn't sit down to watch it exactly, but it was on, and
Hmm.
I. It was the scene where the Nazgul are trying to get Frodo at the before they get to Rivendell, and that whole scene just I found the whole thing very fascinating. It was awesome to me to learn that the ring in The Hobbit was the ring in Lord of the Rings, and
Yeah.
this idea that there was this vast deep history that you could learn, like why I fell in love with the languages and all that kind of thing. But that rapidly led to me reading the Fellowship of the Ring, and then the whole trilogy, and eventually the Silmarillion and other things, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But that was what sucked me in, and it was really I was looking at the timeline, really a very intense sort of period for my young mind. Really, from '77, because I
Hmm.
know I had read the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion before Unfinished Tales came out, and that was in 1980. So it was pretty quick, very compact, and very important to me. How about yourself?
Well, to the surprise of absolutely no one, I was a library kid. I hung around the library quite a lot when I was a kid and found The Hobbit, read it, and just loved it. And we'll get into the things that we loved or didn't love
Yes.
about the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings in a little bit here. But it took a little bit of time. I can't really say exactly how long to get to the Lord of the Rings, as much as I like The Hobbit. And so this
Hmm.
goes back to like a recurring theme in this podcast about scarcity in the early days of
Yes.
geekery. So, got The Hobbit, read it, looked, I think at the list of books by Tolkien and say, oh, there's more.
Right.
But the other books were oddly difficult to track down. It was, I think, eventually I got the Ballantine editions
Hmm.
of the paperbacks. I did not get the bootleg Ace paperbacks
Oh
until
yeah,
later in
yeah.
life.
Yeah.
So if anybody knows about that, there was this completely unsanctioned publication run by Ace Books where they just said, "Screw it, we don't have any approval from the Tolkien estate, but we're just going to just publish these books." And so I got those editions and read them. It wasn't like you could just go to the bookstore at the mall and be confident that you'd find all the books. And I don't think I got all the Ballantine paperbacks in used condition even at the same time. I think I got maybe two of them, and then I had to get the third. I think I got like Fellowship and Return of the King, and then eventually, not too long afterwards, found a copy of The Two Towers. Um, and I would say that then just to kind of get a little bit ahead of things, I think this is the point in my life where I really felt the power of books in
Yes.
general,
Yes.
right? So here is this just absolutely splendid world built, this kind of great adventure story, all the things we're going to talk about that we liked about it, and it just made such a huge impression on me. It was one of the first books or sets of books that I read that just etched themselves on my brain in a way that like Dune did later, where I
Right.
actually didn't feel like I needed to reread them. I mean, I remembered so much from them. And I didn't, also feel a need for someone to give me an illustrated version of it or I was kind of okay with the idea later on that there would be a movie adaptation of it,
Right.
but yeah, I didn't think that the experience of reading those books, even if I did them again, was somehow lacking because there wasn't all this other sort of visual media
That's true.
attached to it.
I mean, as books, they were magical is maybe too on the nose, but they were revelatory in that sense.
Hmm.
There was a depth to them that I had not experienced, and I was already I was a library kid too, loved libraries, and I loved books. And I had read, I would say again, this is late elementary, early middle school. I like my favorite book prior to the Hobbit was Charlotte's Web, which I was one that would read books over and over again. Once I lit
Hmm.
something, I wanted to re-experience it. And I'd read A Wrinkle in Time and some of those the sequels to those books
Yeah, same
and some
here.
other things, but those are the ones that stick in my mind. And so in this pantheon of books in my head that really just
Hmm.
grabbed me was Charlotte's Web, and then it was The Hobbit. And then and yeah, the scarcity thing was relevant. Now my mother had a copy of The Hobbit. That's how I got it. And then yeah, those the Ballantine issues, the editions, the one that had the Tolkien art on the covers. They were kind of
Yeah.
white um, and but all I had initially read the hardcover Lord of the Fellowship of the Ring that as I mentioned in the previous podcast, at my middle school library in Temple, Texas, that I still again can see exactly where that book was, but they only had Fellowship of the Ring. You know, the acquisitions librarian didn't buy the other two books. Like, what's wrong with you people?
Yeah.
So you know, eventually would, but again, got those. I did get those at the mall.
Hmm.
But I was a couple years younger than you, so I think it was a little more, you know, available. But but even then, right, you weren't always guaranteed to go in the bookstore, and then the ones you wanted weren't necessarily there. That's
Yeah.
certainly true. Um, and then you know, I got the Silmarillion not long thereafter. It was much more difficult to read because it's just not as it was not as narrative. It's a collection
Yeah.
of and it was so excited when Unfinished Tales came out because it was like, oh, there's more. I want more. It
Hmm.
was Tolkien actually is a good, I think, a good illustration of the scarcity thing that we're talking about. At least in my early experience, right? That it was there was really The Hobbit and there was the trilogy and then this sort of ancillary stuff, and there really wasn't going to be anything else. I mean, one, he had died by
Right.
the time I discovered his book, so he wasn't going to write anymore. And while there was this release, and we could maybe talk a little bit about, you know, the what do they call them? The Book of Lost Tales, I think.
Yeah.
And I have some of them. I have the first several. I read them, but they're mostly just like basically publishing rough drafts and things, right? And like I read The Children of Hurin that came out a couple of years ago. I've
Hmm.
got um another one. What is it? I can't remember which one it is now that I haven't read.
Well, it just seemed complete, probably to both of us. I mean,
Yeah,
The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, other things were that got published were just sort of icing.
yeah, that's right, that's right.
Yeah.
And yeah, I didn't. Well, we'll talk about this, I think, quite a bit in a minute. But I mean, I always initially thought these were like largely unfilmable things. The Hobbit movie
Yeah.
was kind of silly once I realized it didn't really wasn't that great. The Lord of the Lord of the Rings movie, the incomplete story really, because they only kind of get to the beginning of the Two Towers and they kind of quit. And the sequels that I thought was interesting and captured some of the narrative to me. I don't know what your experience was with that,
Hmm.
but it was not satisfactory. And I wasn't necessarily upset that it was never, you know, finished. Although there was the horrendous Return of the King movie that also was that Rankin and Bass stuff. That is, I watched part of that, by the way, to
Oh,
prepare for
okay.
this. Holy cow! I remembered it because it has a series of really absurd songs in it, right? Um, Frodo of the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom, sung by this minstrel guy, and my favorite. Again, I keep talking about. I want to have some sound drops in
Hmm.
this podcast, but there was this thing with the orcs sing, "Where there's a whip, there's a way." Do you remember this movie? Did you see this movie?
I did not see this movie.
It is. Oh, it is. So somehow, and I did some research. So apparently, for reasons I don't totally understand, Rankin and Bass had the rights, but not to the first book, but like they could only like do part of it. So it picks up. It's done partially in flashback. They're already at Rivendell. They're there with Elrond, and it's in the same style as the Hobbit movie. So the elves look that way and
Yeah.
whatnot. And then this minstrel comes out and starts singing this song about Frodo, the Nine Fingers, and the Ring of Doom, and it was just. I remember as a kid who we've talked about how hungry we were for all this stuff. I thought it was utterly ridiculous, and my
Yeah.
friends and I who had read the books thought this is the dumbest thing. And in watching it, it's sort of really remarkable how much it does kind of have the same feel, even though it's a cartoon of the Rankin and Bass Christmas specials. It just really
Mhm.
kind of feels like it. Some of the
Yeah.
narrative stylish, and it's just, but yeah, it's
I think I didn't see it because this was the first time in my life that I thought, if something is a special book or set of books to
mhm,
me, I don't want to see them ruined on the screen. I don't need that experience.
right.
So as you said, as much as we scavenge as much as we could, of geek culture at the time, there were limits.
Sure. Well, you
There
saved
were things
yourself.
you just you didn't want to
Because
venture there.
I mean, burned in my brain some of those awful songs. Anyway.
Okay. Now I oddly want to see it,
Oh
you know,
no,
or just excerpt from it a little bit, just skim
it's
through parts of it.
definitely worth to go to YouTube and find some. I mean, in that sense, it is absurd.
Okay. Well,
But let's go back. Yeah,
let's go into the Hobbit
yeah,
specifically, because that is the gateway
sure.
drug to the Lord of the Rings and epic fantasy fiction in general, and so many other things. So, what did you like about it?
So I think, I mean, so many things. As I've already alluded, the fact that it felt like this was a world that had been thought out and existed, the fact that there were these maps and there were this language and there was a
Hmm.
history and there was, the whole well, the quest of it all, which is a pretty standard story format, but it was, these characters were compelling and I wanted to know what was going to happen and it was um just so much more deep in its own world than other things that I had encountered at that point. How
Yeah.
about yourself?
Well, a lot of things. So I think we're just probably kind of volley
Sure.
back and forth here. I really liked about it was it ramped up from the mundane to the fantastic really well,
Yes.
and the fantastic elements. Just it's I struggle for the right word for this. The things that you had possibly heard of before, elves,
Hmm.
goblins, dragons, wizards, and so forth, they just didn't seem hackneyed.
Right.
They seemed, in artistic terms, kind of sincere, right? It wasn't just like a bad knockoff of somebody else's idea.
Right.
And the unfamiliar elements were also terrific. So the spiders and Mirkwood were a real surprise. I remember when I was a kid. The idea of the ring, whatever kind of creature Gollum was.
Yes.
Uh, anyway, so it was I thought just impressive both on the familiar and the unfamiliar fronts. And the world was a magical place, but it wasn't just sort of this topsy turvy, upside down world of constant chaos. It seemed like really the magical elements of it, because we now call this low magic, but it just seemed to be sort of a natural part of the world and didn't sort of overwhelm things
That's right.
in the story.
Well, it didn't, to your point, about these different elements, right? Because I
Mhm.
certainly had encountered dragons and wizards and elves and dwarves and whatnot, but it didn't feel like a fairy tale, which
Right.
always seemed very superficial, right?
It
I
was
mean,
written for a younger audience, but it wasn't childish.
that's a very good point. I think the dwarves the seven dwarves were the dwarves that I'd seen, which was,
Yes.
a fantastical, it was more fairy tale setting than, yeah, it was like this weird, well, not weird, this interesting sort of mixture of the magical, but with the mundane or the real. And you're right, the magic does not overpower any of it, right?
Hmm.
Because the magic's limited. There's only like while the swords may glow and orcs are around, that's not a hugely magical thing. That's kind of
Right.
semi-practical. The ring is one of the few magical items they really encounter. Even though Gandalf's a wizard, he's not constantly casting spells.
Hmm.
And the different, people groups may have their own important characteristics, but they're not. They seem to be sort of an actual ecosystem in which they all existed,
Right.
right?
Yeah, and they didn't bother to explain how magic worked. There
That's
wasn't
right.
a magic system. Bjorn, the shapeshifter, never
Yeah,
really kind of
that's right.
explained what he was all about or how that particular version of lycanthropy worked. I think that he really kind of saved his fantastical ammunition for Smaug, the dragon, right?
Yeah,
So there
that's
was
right.
going to be like one big fantastical creature or thing in the story that the story was leading up to, and it was damn impressive once you got at that destination.
Yes, that's correct. It was just a compelling story. It wasn't boring.
Yeah. The tone was interesting, and I in rereading this, it struck me just how lightly comedic it was,
Yes.
especially in the first parts. Yeah, not quite like over the top Terry Pratchett level, but clearly Tolkien was having fun when he was writing it, and I'm sure I remember enjoying that when I was a kid reading it. That kind of like the author was saying, let's have some fun here. We're going to be doing some serious and scary things too, but let's have some our fun moments here. The pacing was generally good, I thought, except after the death of Smaug.
Yeah.
I thought it kind
There,
of dragged after that.
there's some moments. I think too, it was an actual interesting journey for Bilbo from not prepared to be a hero to becoming a hero.
Yes,
And it's well developed. That story is well developed.
yeah.
And
The
it's not,
ordinary person turned into a not exactly a hero. Like actually, Tolkien says at some point, and it struck me when I was rereading this. It's like, well, we needed a hero, like with a capital H hero. I
Mhm.
seem to remember some part of it, like making reference to that. Like there's this concept of what would normally be a heroic fantasy sort of hero, but that's not what Bilbo is. He's a person who has unexpected skills and courage and just general trustworthiness.
And some which he didn't know that he had until he had to,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Anything you didn't like when you read it?
I don't know that anything really specific. I mean, I had mixed feelings about some of the poetry and songs. I wouldn't always
Yeah.
read them.
I think that's a common
Yeah,
reaction.
yeah, yeah. There. I would have to reread the book, and it's been that long. I realize it's been a long time, there are a few things that do drag a little bit as they're questing through Mirkwood. It seems like, as I recall, but no, I think overall, I found it just was almost perfect at that time in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything you said. I mean, I said that, already that I thought the last two chapters were a little slow. And even oddly, the Battle of Five Armies,
Yeah, I think that's right.
it didn't make that a big of impression. Certainly not the way that the battles and sieges did in Lord of the Rings.
Something that I did at the time was disappointed in, but then the Lord of the Rings solved this problem for me was I wanted a map of the whole place and not just the specific locations.
Yeah, yeah.
I was always a map guy. Maps, I just love maps.
And I also liked, although I didn't conceive of it then the way I conceive of it now, was that not every problem had a violent solution.
Mm,
I think that if this had been more Robert E. Howard like, that you
right.
had like the characters hacking and slashing their way through the plot, it would have been less appealing than just saying, okay, how are we going to bust out of the elves jail? Well,
That's right.
okay, I've got a plan. It involves barrels and the invisibility ring and keeping the elves distracted and so forth. I think that as an element of my early encounters with Tolkien was certainly appealing.
No, I think that's a good point. It was different in that sense.
Yeah, yeah. All right, Lord of the Rings. What we liked. I felt like Lord of the Rings did a good job too of like going from the fairly ordinary lives of the hobbits into the fantastic. You
Yes.
have, Bilbo's birthday party, and then you're at the Prancing Pony, and things are getting weirder and weirder as you go along. The Nazgul show up, hunting them, and Strider shows up, and there are barrow wights and other crazy things. But I thought that was a good
And
narrative method.
Tom Bombadillo. Yeah.
Tom Bombadil is a merry old fellow.
But yeah, I think the Lord of the Rings was it. It really did feel like stepping. It's almost like The Hobbit was this very narrow, somewhat contained part of this world, and when you
Mhm.
got to Lord of the Rings, it sort of took the cover off, and you saw so much more, right?
Right.
And obviously, it was written to a broader, well, maybe a more mature audience, and also obviously he brought in his this mythology he'd been working on in previous works that had not been published, and trying to make those connections, and it really did take on this entirely deeper and more profound, to me at least, reality, right? And as I've expressed before, one of the things that appeals to me is this world building is a thing I find very impressive, and this is in some ways the most quintessential example of this. Right, there's this deep history. He knows the lineages of all these characters. There's different
Right.
languages. There's all of these things that were that you got these the tastes of as you went along. Right, it wasn't
Mhm.
stopping to have. Well, it's like reading a real history, or learning about the world around you, right? There's no way you can learn everything. No one can tell you everything that happened in the Revolutionary War, or, name your events, or just want to read the history of
Right.
Germany. There's all these things that have happened, and you have to, like, you get hints that, oh, I would like to know more about that, or I would like to know more about that. And like in the real world, you can always go find those things because they exist. And in Tolkien's world, a lot of it you could go find out. You just didn't, you didn't know where it was at that time as a kid, but it actually ended up existing in some ways. So that was really, really appealing to me. And the characters are very fascinating, and it does create this really, truly impressive quest that, well, and the way that it plays out, and it also has
Mhm.
consequences. It just doesn't end, right?
Yeah.
They destroy the ring, but there's still consequences for all that's happened, and they have to deal with it, both personal consequences and other the stuff in the Shire and what have you. So I liked all that as well.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah. I mean, I have a section here in my notes about the different elements of verisimilitude in, what is effectively the most fantastic sort of fiction you could think of, and how you, as a writer, are able to make people feel like you're having plausible characters in an interesting place doing things that involve fantastical elements, but are still, there's still enough of a suspension of disbelief, if that's even the right word. I
Right.
mean, you don't believe this world exists, but it's at least, I guess, go back to the word I just used, plausible enough in some sort of artistic sense or some sort of emotional sense that you are engaged with it and happy to go along with it. So you always felt like you were in a real place. He was very good about doing explanations of things, including, mentions of the flora and fauna, or, oh, look over there, there's this little ruin over here that, has some sort of historical significance, without going into the deep, deep story behind it,
Right.
without an exposition dump. The languages, the songs, the maps. Again, you
Yes.
mentioned the maps. The maps, I think, contributed hugely to that sense of place, being plausible, and just like little touches every once in a while. They're camped out and they're hearing noises in the night, and maybe what they're hearing are the Nazgul chasing them. Anyway, it just did such a good job of that it kept you going through the book. Um, I think the characters were good. I think that the flawed characters like Boromir,
Hmm.
the more, noble characters. Although I don't want to, kind of dump on Boromir. I think that there's been a lot of sort of Boromir revisiting about just, okay, he was a flawed person. He was capable of being corrupted, which is, of course, the big theme of the Lord of the Rings is about corruption,
Yes.
by, for, what he thought were good reasons. But anyway, all the characters were good. The chase was fun. I don't want to get too far ahead of things, but there was always something different in each section that made the book fascinating and fun, and at times exhilarating or terrifying, whether it was like being thrown into the siege of Helm's Deep, or you're at the scene where the Nazgul are searching for the hobbits, and they're kind of sniffing around.
Yes.
It was a real touch, I thought. So whether it was like, this is the chapter where I'm scared, this is the chapter where I'm kind of swept up in the action, or this is the chapter where I wonder what the heck they're going to do now that the fellowship is broken up. I mean, there was always like a different sort of feeling or puzzle to solve or whatever at each of those waypoints in the story.
Yeah, I agree. And you cared about the characters
Oh yeah.
very deeply. I found certainly as a child, but even now, I mean, I find the ending anywhere from the whole thing with Sam and Frodo and Mount Doom and all of that is very, I think, very touching and moving
Hmm.
and well done.
Yeah. Yeah, and even reading it as a kid, I think this is a more grown up set of novels than
Yes.
the Hobbit was. I guess I was at an age where I was able to appreciate what they were trying to do. So the political intrigue in Gondor and Rohan, I thought that was, as a kid, really fascinating. That you have the steward of Gondor being kind of a questionable figure, and what do you
Right.
do about that?
Right.
And the same with Theoden when he's under the influence of what's his
Primo
name?
Wormtongue.
Yeah, Wormtongue. Thank you. Um, I'm looking at my notes here. And to just go back to, again, the heroism of ordinary people. I mean, you just still had characters who were kings in exile, but they still seemed relatable. You didn't
Yes.
have, and of course, Sam and Frodo being the most relatable characters, but it wasn't like the continuum didn't stretch too far, at least in the way that the characters were presented.
No, in some ways it was ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Aragorn being the one that was the one that had this lineage. But I mean, and it contrasts with a whole lot of other fantasy books that I've read, and this is something we'll talk about in the future. Often it's oh, you're actually the prince who was promised kind of thing, instead
Yeah,
of, and that discovery. In this case, I mean, Frodo always was an ordinary dude who happened to find himself in an extraordinary circumstance, and he and Sam and Peregrine and Mary had to like really leave their comfort and go do this thing that really only an ordinary person could do. I think that's one of the things about the story that's very compelling, right? Because it was the notion that you couldn't give the ring to the really powerful people because it would corrupt them. You couldn't give it to
right.
Gandalf. You couldn't give it to Galadriel. You couldn't give it to Elrond. They had to bear the burden and solve this problem. Um, Even though it really wasn't a problem, they either the hobbits didn't create the problem. Oh, Bilbo found a ring, um, and
Hmm.
but it became this thing that was evil and had to be taken care of.
Right.
So that part of it is, I think, was very compelling as a child, and it's a compelling story now as an adult.
Yeah,
Um,
there wasn't, as you said, one chosen one
no,
in the narrative. I mean, you really needed to have, the various uh, heroic figures play their part,
yes,
from Frodo and Sam to Gandalf to Aragorn to Eowyn to others.
hmm
That they all had a part to play.
yes, yes, they did. So yeah, it's just it's a fantastic set of books.
Yeah, and how much more interesting is that than the typical kind of, I would consider, juvenile chosen one narrative? Where there is only one person who really matters.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's which has been done to death, and even the things that I like. But I mean, isn't that one of the flaws of Star Wars that it becomes too much about the Skywalkers?
Oh yes, I feel that
Um,
strongly. Or
yes.
even, like something that's a little bit more obscure, but kind of falls within the same timeline of when I was reading books like these, like the Edgar Rice Burroughs novels, whether it was Tarzan or John Carter or whomever,
Hmm.
that hero was always the centerpiece, right? Like,
Yes,
you
that's
know,
right.
nothing would happen, no problem would ever get fixed without that character. And that's kind of boring, I have to
Yeah,
say.
it can
Aside
be.
from it being unbelievable and having some sort of very, I would say, unsavory political undertones,
Yes.
that it just was boring compared to The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. So I let's talk about a little bit about, well, there's two things we can maybe branch out on. We
Yeah.
talked before about merge with other properties, but of course with Lord of the Rings, at least at the time that we were encountering it, unlike now, but there was no real merch, except again for me it was whatever additional books might be found, either things like Unfinished Tales, but or
Right.
I mean heavens, I remember getting and being very excited to get the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. That just a it was it's
Hmm.
something else that he wrote,
Right.
even though it really wasn't about any of these characters. Or I have still have the Atlas of Middle Earth. That was like I
Hmm.
really loved that. Again, maps and more maps, and that's how I really helped absorb some of the first and second age stuff. Really was in that book, in addition to the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, or the stuff that's in the appendices of the Lord of the Rings. But I also did you ever listen to any of the dramas that were made?
No, I didn't.
There was an American Lord of the Rings, and then there was a British production. And I know that I listened to both of them. I used to really love radio dramas, and it was the NPR stations that I had access to in Texas had a lot of radio dramas. And I don't really remember the American version. I think I only listened to it the one time
Hmm.
when it was actually on the radio, and I just remember the British version was so much better. In fact, I had recorded on I probably may have the tapes around here somewhere. Um, you know, Memorex cassette tapes that I have no way to play them now.
Yeah.
But I listened to that over and over again. And that was theater of the mind kind of stuff that we talked about before,
Right. Right.
where it was well acted and sound, but it was mostly just a very faithful adaptation of the novels. But that was like the closest thing to merch. Although I think you had mentioned the calendars also kind of
Oh,
fit in that
yeah.
category.
Yeah, and I think the calendars are kind of a good illustration of a lot of things about
No pun
Lord of the
intended.
Rings. um, they were purely illustrations, right? So for people who didn't know about these in the past, that back in the 1970s, I think were the first ones, in the early
Probably, yeah.
70s, that these calendars would come out every year, and they were originally Tolkien's own illustrations, or like a picture of him would be
Yes.
one of the months and so forth. And then they started to add in these artists who had 12 different pictures from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and they were really just about all you needed, right? It was a kind of a special addition to what you already had with the books, but it didn't again try to replace the
That's
theater of
right.
the mind.
Yeah.
So you had, for example, like my favorite Tolkien artist still is Tim Kirk. He did these, I would say, slightly cartoonish drawings, but they weren't fully cartoonish. But if you're talking about something that is as fantastical as Lord of the Rings is, I think being hyper realistic has its downsides, and at least in kind of graphic art. And then came the brothers Hildebrandt, who were a little more realistic. But what you got was that one little nice reminder of something that you loved about the stories. So, like, we didn't talk
Yes.
about the fantastical elements in the Lord of the Rings. But like you take something like I think probably everybody who's a fan of the books and really impressed them when they first read them, which was the Balrog, and you'd see
Yes.
different artists' takes on the Balrog or different artists' takes on Smaug, or on other fantastical creatures or elements of the story or whatever, or you'd get like a battle scene, that was interpreted differently by one artist versus another, and that was cool. But it wasn't trying to like overwhelm your experience of reading the books with all this other stuff. It wasn't like, well, the book came out and now there's the calendar and the t-shirts and the video
Right,
games
right,
and the animated
right,
series and
right, right.
the movie adaptation. It was just these calendars. And I thought that was kind of perfect, actually.
I do remember. I mean, I never purchased any of those calendars. Of course, one of the great things about the calendars were I could go to the bookstore and look at them for free and then put them back on the rack. Yes, smiting capitalism,
Yes,
as a young
and my
child.
my family
Yeah,
were the people behind
I
the counter
know.
looking at
Sorry
you
about
saying, "Are
that.
you going to buy that, kid?"
That's right. It was a B.
Yeah.
Dalton or like what was the
Hmm.
bookstore? Walden Books in the
Yeah,
Temple
Walden.
Mall. So it
Yeah,
wasn't.
okay.
I wasn't. I was. It was not for the independent booksellers. So it's fine. But that's right. No doubt. But yeah, I do remember. I couldn't conjure, but you mentioned the Hildebrand, and I do remember those very distinctly, and the Tim Kirk illustrations also.
Hmm.
I recall. And you're right. It was this sort of opportunity to at least have some of it visualized, and the fact that it was not always the same artist was nice.
Yeah. And again, I would kind of keep hitting on this particular note, because I think it's important. But there are things that you show, and there are things you don't show.
Right.
Like, and there are things that you tell, and there are things that you don't tell in order to make a successful fantasy story. So you could tell just enough of the history to have a timeline in the appendix, or enough of the geography to have a book of maps and so forth. But you don't have to have it in super high resolution detail on all the aspects of the background to enjoy Lord of the Rings. You didn't need the big exposition dump in order to do that. And one thing that impressed me about the calendars was, and other sources of illustration later on, was like they didn't try to show us Sauron. Which
That's true.
I thought in the books was one of the better choices Tolkien made, was the big bad villain. You never saw him, and you never had then what would have inevitably been a little bit of disappointment, I think, which maybe that's something we could talk about, where in the movie they did show Sauron.
Right.
But you never had that moment. It's like, yeah, he's not quite as scary, not quite what I expected, or whatever the source of disappointment might be. He was always the big ultimate evil in the background.
No, that's true. He was that's a funny. I mean, funny is not the right word. It's an interesting observation about the novels. While you do see orcs and you do see the Balrog and you do see Saruman and some other villainous characters, the Sauron himself is almost just an abstraction of evil um,
Yeah.
that you never fully encounter. But I mean, speaking, maybe this is a good place to make a transition to talk about the movies. I think
Hmm.
that the Peter Jackson films that came out starting in 2001, which is we're going on almost a quarter century now, which doesn't seem quite right. But hey, we are, as you say, geeks of a certain age, and time has its own dilation at some point.
Hmm.
So I was thinking about it really because it's interesting to me in the context of the podcast's sort of underlying theme, because it is with the Peter Jackson movies more than anything else that this property moves from this somewhat limited space. You had to have read the books, and only
Right.
certain kinds of people are going to read those books, even though they're very popular books, to a more mass consumed product, right? Where like people that are not going to read these books nonetheless are quite well aware of the story, the content of the story, the memes and all this kind of stuff that sort of are generated over time as a result of the movie. I and I don't know that we ever talked about this. So now this is like
Hmm.
being revealed for the first time for the public to consume our point of view on this. I like I said earlier, I used to think that The Lord of the Rings was unfilmable. I didn't think that it
Yeah.
was something that could be produced. I was incredibly impressed with the Peter Jackson movies. I enjoyed them very much, although I would agree, or maybe I would piggyback off of something that you said, that to a degree it changed some of the magic. It didn't take it away the magic of the books because the books are still magical and they're masterpieces.
Hmm.
But there is a certain degree to which is impossible after you consume movies like this to not have it affect the way you think about the
Right.
book, right?
Right.
And it does change this experience. Um, maybe for the worse, maybe not, but it's different, right? So, and I thought about it also in conjunction with some other properties that have become filmed lately, right? I mean, like Game of Thrones, how there was a, if you listen to, I don't know if you ever did, but if you listen to various podcasts, say about Game of Thrones, there were
Hmm.
always a distinction between people who were book readers and who were just viewers, and it's a different experience, right? If you know the Red Wedding's coming, spoilers, people, the Red Wedding's a big deal. If you don't know,
Yeah.
cover your ears. But if you know it's coming, because you've read the books, it's a different experience watching it than if you didn't know that it was coming, right?
Right.
And so it's an interesting sort of transformation of these properties when they're no longer solely existing in the written form. What are your I don't know what are your thoughts about the Peter Jackson movies? And am I just rambling or am I making any sense at all?
No, you're not rambling at all. I mean, I think that, I think this is a good segue into the Tolkien legacy in general.
Yes,
So I also thought that they were unfilmable. And of course, Peter Jackson proved us all wrong.
yes,
And I definitely enjoyed the movies quite a lot. I think they're masterpieces in their own way
I
as
agree.
as movies. I don't have any real beefs to pick about, like, leaving out Tom Bombadil
Oh
or,
no, no.
whatever. I think that's all fine. I I do treat them as different experiences, as
Yes,
as you said, and I appreciate everything that Jackson did in order to try to create as much continuity between the books and the movies as possible. With having to trim things at times. The Barrow-wights weren't there in the
right,
movies, but he did use a kind of a very great Tolkien artist, John Howe, to do the production design. So the look and feel of the movies is very much rooted in sort of the Tolkien extended world, not just the books, but also the calendars and other things
right.
that existed. Um, I I have a funny story to tell. This is totally unrelated to my reaction, but I have never seen the ending of The Return of the King,
Really.
and here's why. The first time that we went to the theater to see it, we were of course very excited about it. We'd seen the previous two movies and were very impressed and wanted to see the next one. And right at the point where the Sam and Frodo get to Mount Doom, all the power went off in the theater we were seeing the movie in. And there were just like uncomfortable shuffling and coughing and so forth at first, and then nobody from the theater staff showed up, and then finally they did, and they said, well, we're not going to be able to bring the movie back, so we'll refund your ticket, and you can come back at some other time. And we didn't actually come back and see it in the theaters. And then I had a good friend, Chris, if you're listening, I'm talking about you, who would do these marathons of the three movies. And I showed up to one of them, and my daughter got sick when we were in the middle of watching them. And so, right at practically the same point in the movie, I got a call saying, she's sick, come home. Which I had to leave. So, and I haven't rewatched them all the way to the end, and I'm kind of scared to. Like, what would happen if I actually saw the ending of these movies? Is there
Well,
some sort of
there
universal conspiracy to stop me from seeing them for a good reason? I don't know.
there are ways to do this. I think you'd be safe to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's yeah.
I could
Maybe
just skip ahead to the end,
I would. My
That
recommendation would
technology
be
does
just to
exist.
like yeah, to blow your mind. There's these you can scrub through, and it's amazing what you can do with technology these
Yeah.
days. But yeah, yeah,
So,
that's
like, but
fine.
all the people listening who, are now saying, like, how could you call yourself a Tolkien fan if you haven't seen the
That's
ending
right.
of the trilogy of
So did
movies?
you? I mean, not to jump because we may have more to say about the trilogy or not. But I mean, did you watch the Hobbit trilogy as well?
Oh yeah, and I hated them. I actually I didn't see the last
I
one.
didn't hate's a strong word, but I'm as I it may be emerging as I talk about various properties. It takes like if I actually say I hate something, it's got to be awfully bad. I don't know. That's just my predisposition, but I've figured out deep somewhere toward the end of the first one because my wife is not a reader of she's a reader, but she never would read something like Lord of the Rings, but she did enjoy the movies. And we went to see The Hobbit, the first one, and I realized I don't know what the scene was, but I remember having this thought in the theater. Oh, she's not going to watch the next one because boy, this is taking so long to get just to this point in the story. Because again, I know the novel quite well, and they were dragging it out, and I'm like, oh my Lord. I mean, I could see it making two movies out of it. The three movies was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it just felt like, it's like the joke at the end of Spaceballs 2, The Quest for More Money. It just didn't do it for me. And
Yeah.
I feel like I think I've seen all of them, but the third one, I didn't even go to the theater to see the third one. I know that I waited and
No, I
watched it.
saw the first two, and I didn't need to see the next one. I thought it really violated a lot of what was good about the movie adaptations of Lord of the Rings. For example, the CGI. I mean, I felt
Yeah,
the CGI was the enabling technology that made it possible to bring Lord of the Rings to the screen.
right.
I felt it was just sort of an orgy of CGI
Yes.
and of action, needless action scenes, which really wasn't the feel of the original book.
Correct.
Which those were the two biggest violations, and then of course it was too long,
So
and
long.
yeah, and just the introduction of new characters who weren't that interesting or
Yes.
like sort of cartoonish, like
Oh
Stephen
yeah.
Fry's character. That was kind of dumb.
Oh,
It just
the romance with one of the I can't even now I'm, like having these flashbacks because I really haven't revisited these films in a
oh
very
the
long
the
time.
the elvish woman who becomes the
Yes.
love interest for Thorin. I
Yes.
I just didn't need all that.
No, I
Right.
didn't
It's
need
just
all that.
and again, it's like where you have something that you have read that you really enjoy, and there's a point where other media can add to that,
Yes.
or again, kind of press on a particular neuron that makes you remember something that you really liked. But then this was just sort of an overwhelming, amusement park ride that just wasn't The Hobbit for me. So I said, okay, I don't need to see the third one.
Yeah, that's fair. And yeah, it was, I
Yeah.
know I didn't go to the theater. I feel like I've seen it, but I don't really remember if I watched it, it was only, I have to watched it. It was,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, let's jump back in time a little bit, if you don't
let's do that.
mind. So let's talk
No,
about the immediate legacy of Tolkien when
okay.
we were young.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it's certainly, I would say, made a lot of the popularity of other fantasy writers enhanced as
Oh
when
yes.
Tolkien got read by more and more people. I think probably when I first encountered it, Tolkien was well respected by a very small audience, but by the time maybe 10 years later, there was enough kind of momentum behind Tolkien that I think that it certainly helped other writers. And there was a period of a lot of diversity for fantasy. I mean, that there were people who were clearly just trying to imitate Tolkien.
Yes.
Like the
Yes.
Sword of Shannara series was
Yes.
a abysmally transparent
Yeah. So
effort to steal that.
I was just very precocious or pretentious is maybe the better word
Yeah.
about when I was, in eighth grade. Like, I don't want to read your fake Lord of the Rings. And in
Yes.
fact, I started this sort of Shannara and never finished it because I felt like it was just a ripoff.
Yeah.
Um, no, I mean, that may not be entirely fair. I know there's a bunch of Shannara books and people like them. That's fine. And there was this weird mix, right? For me, at least, I was like trying to scratch that same itch with other writers, but I also didn't want a blatant ripoff either. And
Right.
it was some difficulty sometimes in finding stuff that would really scratch that itch.
Well, and the other fantasy that existed at the time wasn't really thematically the same as
Right.
Tolkien. And I would say that it was also much more short form based than Tolkien was. So
Hmm.
not everything in fantasy at that time, in fact, very few things in fantasy at that time were these epic multi-novel,
Right.
story arcs. You had a lot of writers at the time. Fritz Leiber, Michael Moorcock, Robert E. Howard, Jack Vance, Roger Zelazny was
Hmm.
probably the exception with the Amber series, and others who would write, either like a novel at the most, like Bull Anderson wrote Three Hearts and Three Lions and The Broken Sword, and that they were self-contained and there didn't have to be any sequels, and nor were there.
Right.
uh, or these were really like collections of short stories that
Yes.
may have had some sort of continuity and timeline and characters and so forth, but each one told its own very sharp little story, and then you moved on to the next one. And we live in a very different sort of world now with fantasy fiction, where it is dominated by the very long form, 10
Oh,
novels,
yes. Yep.
stretching out a story with, everything's epic. And that wasn't what fantasy was originally like. As I said, there were exceptions. There were, the Amber series, or actually two different series that Roger
Right.
Zelazny wrote. Or he had characters, you had authors like Anne McCaffrey, who also wrote series of
Yes.
novels,
Yes.
either fantasy or science fantasy, whatever you want to call them. But the norm was more the short form.
There was more, yeah, the short form is a lot of short form. And but even I don't know. I'm pausing because I'm thinking there were series like the Dragon Riders of Pern,
Mm-hmm.
um, but they didn't quite have the same feel as, say, The Wheel of Time, which is just this ponderous giant books and trying to tell this whole story in quite the same way. So, but yeah,
Yeah, and you can
there was
probably
not.
detect, anybody listening, which of those I prefer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
even like the Amber series, it didn't have they weren't tomes.
Yes.
They were shorter books. Um, I don't know. I really hadn't thought about this, so I'm maybe allowing myself to try to go through this mental catalog of authors and whatnot. Because the funny thing, I guess, here's my maybe this is the way I would jump into it because while I have very distinct memories of some of the things that you mentioned, some of the other things you other mentioned, I didn't really fully partake of. Like I'm very aware of Elric and Michael Moorcock, but I don't know that I've ever read any Elric, any of the stories. I think I own some of the books.
You're
Someone gave
you're
me.
dead to me now,
I
Stephen.
know. I have to work on that. Uh, I there was this really weird mix for me, at least, uh, of 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 having read The Lord of the Rings and then very rapidly thereafter encountering Dungeons and Dragons, which partially to me was, I mean, not partially, it's clearly influenced by Tolkien, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien, the way the elves and the orcs and all that sort of stuff, the halflings, and then various other sort of fantasy properties like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser or you know these just, but it's all kind of a mix in my brain. And Elric, I mean, I knew Elric existed, and a friend of mine would talk about. I think there was well, something with D&D and Elric that maybe it was in Dragon Magazine. I can't remember. Um, Regardless, I
Yeah.
digress in a way that doesn't make any sense. But
Well, no. So, but what bothers me a lot about the kind of the crushing emphasis on sagas, long form multi novel stories right now, is that there are a lot of great stories you could tell that deserve to be just a short story. And like there was a fantasy writer, C.L. Moore, not one of the most famous names out there, not anywhere near Tolkien, but like she has a great story, The Black God's Kiss, and
mm,
it's
mm,
a great revenge story in a way. But how do you then embed something like that in these huge novels?
right,
Or
right,
series of novels. Just like you have an idea, it has punch to it. It does its job, and then you get out in 30 pages, and life is good. And that's just not where fantasy fiction in general, except there are now all kinds of little zines, sort of,
Yes.
and smaller publishers and so forth, but really just all the big writers right now are writing these giant series.
Well, I think in some ways you talk about this being as it pertains to Tolkien's legacy, right? So this
Hmm.
is weird. I'm trying to wrap my head around how I want to say this. So on the one hand, The Lord of the Rings is this multi-toned, epic story that requires three large books to tell and is very much the product of world building and trying to like create the maps and the languages and all this kind of stuff that we love so much. But on the other hand, there's a degree to which it's finite. It's so finite, really. It's really, again,
Hmm.
it's The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and some ancillary stuff. Really, in terms of
Yeah.
narrative stories, there's really two narrative stories. There's the story of The Hobbit, and there's the story of the Lord of the Rings. You can read about Beren and Luthien, and you can read about all this stuff, but it's never quite the same kind of true narrative. So it's Tolkien is both this both seems like the big story, but also is finite. While you get to something like The Wheel of Time, which I read and I liked, although good God, it goes on way too long. And
Hmm.
the novels are, I know some people love them and they're probably gonna get mad at me, and that's cool. I'm not saying you can't like what you like, but um, one, they have that whole Messiah sort of backstory because Randolph Thor is like he's the Messiah figure of
Right.
sorts. And it has to be convinced of this over multiple novels, and that's fine. I don't mind that kind of story, but it gets ponderous and trying too hard to do all these things. And instead of being a trilogy or it's I forget like a dozen books I think I can't remember now.
Yeah.
Or the other R.R. that we made passing reference to. I
Hmm.
mean,
Right.
the probably never going to be completed Song of Ice and Fire set of books because it's just I don't think it's going to happen. Because the editor couldn't tell him no, and they wanted to sell more books and whatnot. But
Right.
um, I'm happy to see a big epic story, but at some point you need to finish the damn thing, right? Um,
Right. Well, and I think
and
Tolkien did it just right. I mean, when
yeah,
you say finite, I interpret to mean, okay, there was a story he told from The Hobbit through Return of the King.
yeah,
And it was nice to have the other texts out there,
yes,
but it wasn't like you had to read the Silmarillion first,
no.
and then, read about Numenor, and then you got into The Hobbit and Lord of the
In
Rings.
fact, you probably shouldn't read the Silmarillion first. But
Um,
yeah, I mean, this is it's an underlying theme in
yeah.
my own brain about all these things, and I know that I expect you and I will talk in the future about either prequels or about franchises. Um, and I suppose there is this interesting difficulty in it. It is how much is enough, how much is too much.
Right.
To what degree is it actually better to be left wanting more?
Yes.
And I think Tolkien in particular, The Lord of the Rings it leaves me wanting more.
Hmm.
Even and in some of the
Right.
more that provides, again, it's just inadequate, right? I mean, I realize that there's some value in some of the stuff that gets published later, but it's not really more. It's just some extra. I'm not trying to parse
Well,
out
a
words
lot
here.
of it was Tolkien working out in his own head what he
Yes,
wanted um, to, include in his grand historical narrative of Middle Earth.
yes,
But you didn't have to, as you said, you didn't have to read it, and it is written very differently from
yes.
the
Well,
Lord of the Rings.
some of the history of Middle Earth stuff, the multi volume, it really is rough drafts, which is fun after a
Yeah,
little while. That it's I can't remember even what his name was.
or it's
to really
other things are written as if they were history. You
Yeah,
know,
there's that.
yeah,
There's that too, and that
yeah,
that appeals to me in some ways more than the other. But even then, or like some of his epic poem stuff, I'm like it's kind of fun, but I can't. I'm not an epic poem guy, and I can
yeah.
only do so much of that. And it's just not the same as a narrative, right? I guess I'd put it this way: what in some Fantasyland, since we're talking about fantasy,
Yeah.
would I love for there to have been another set of books by Tolkien about the Lord of the Rings world? Yes, but
Hmm.
maybe it would have been too much, and that would have diminished.
Right.
It's an interesting mixture here. I mean, it's kind of like Peter Jackson's Hobbit movies. It's like it's too much, man. If it would have been better if you'd done a little less.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes less is more.
Yeah, it wasn't, what we're talking about is a time when as beloved and special and popular eventually as Lord of the Rings was, it wasn't a property, quote unquote, or an IP that needed to
Right.
be, immediately followed up on. You know.
Well, and the something I teased at the beginning of the podcast. I mean, I did.
Mm,
I had avoided the Rings of Power is something that at one point in my life I think would have been like, oh, I've got to watch this now. And because at the time that it came out, I don't remember what was going on at the time. I didn't have as much time to consume the program. I kind of didn't immediately jump on it, and then I read enough that people saying they didn't care for it, people that I respected didn't like it, so I just kind of let it sit. And like I said, I watched the first episode. It was fine, but I can already see what some of the critiques were, and maybe we didn't need this thing, especially since the weirdness of the rights issue made it kind of difficult to do it properly in some ways. And it's very minor, but I mean, I immediately this is my nerdery kicking in. They show a
mm,
map of Middle Earth, and I'm like, that's a third age map, dudes. That's not a first age map, and I don't
yes.
like that.
Hmm. Right.
I mean, if we're gonna do this right, I want to
Right.
see the right maps and the right places, and I understand why it's not that way. But anyway,
All right. We might want to talk more about that later,
yeah,
in
that's fair.
another
No,
episode.
I
But
think that there's a lot of there's some themes to discuss.
more about the legacy. So
Yes,
some notes I have on the legacy
please.
because Lord of the Rings is huge in terms of legacy. So you had, I think, probably because of the Silmarillion and other things, one of the first instances of nerd cred. Like there are fans, and then there are the real fans. Which was a thing in early fandom. The
Sure.
people who really went in deep into understanding everything about some beloved set of books or movies or whatever. And certainly the Silmarillion and the Unfinished Tales and so forth provided that.
Yes.
Um, the other thing I would just say is that when computer games and role playing games became big,
Yes.
and Tolkien was just like in the DNA immediately for
Yes.
that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so D&D obviously just had tons of callbacks to the Lord of the Rings, including very explicitly, in kind of the choices of races like orcs and so forth,
Yes.
or halflings, not
Halflings.
hobbits, because
That's
of
right.
copyright reasons.
Sure.
And also too, a lot of the kind of the Tolkien-esque epic fantasy, big quests sort of motif wound up in a lot of the role playing backgrounds that were available for D&D. So like Dragonlance, for example, or
Yes.
there were also things that weren't that at the time were art role playing games that were explicitly not Tolkien like RuneQuest, but I think certainly a lot of the popularity of role playing games was certainly helped by the very easy connection back to
Oh, I mean,
The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings.
speaking for myself, I think part of the appeal for D&D was this idea that we could basically play Lord of the Rings stuff. I mean, in fact,
Yeah,
in middle school, that's we made up entire quests. We just repurposed the rules and
yeah,
had a dungeoning in the mines of Moria kind of thing. I remember
right.
doing all that kind of stuff. That
Yeah, and
was
yeah, role playing, when it kind of, for people who wanted to do something Tolkien-esque, that was called a campaign. It was a
yes,
series of connected episodes when you got together with your friends and played D&D or some other game. And, there was a long story arc and, we had, the episodes were all leading to some sort of denouement.
that's right. That's right. It's good stuff.
There was also, speaking of games, there were the in the 1970s, the SPI war games based on Lord of the Rings, including like the first effort to try to do the whole Lord of the Rings saga in a single board game. That was a little bit of merch I had at the time.
I'm familiar. I don't think I ever played them.
And there were the computer games, which were just, not so much trying to be war games where they were doing something like Tolkien. It was kind of, you saw Tolkien more in the computer role playing games,
Yes.
things like Wizardry and others,
Yes.
Ultima, that they had
Yes.
that very kind of Tolkien-esque or D&D campaign like Grand Quest motif to them. Okay. Big question here. I have a big question. So there was, I guess, a rumor that the Beatles were interested in making a Lord of the Rings movie.
Yes, I've read that. Yeah.
Would it have been a good thing or a bad thing if they had done it?
It probably would have been awful.
It's hard to tell. This is really an unanswerable question for me
Yeah.
because on the one hand, you might say the Beatles would have given that even that much more appeal to Tolkien potentially, even if it had been a bad movie.
Yeah, that's fair. Oh, it's one of these alternate history things. Would I like to see what it would have looked like? And I guess partially it
Mm-hmm.
depends on were the Beatles themselves going to make this movie? Were they going to fund this movie? I guess I always kind of understood it to be funding more than necessarily making themselves. But and then, although I suppose I'm trying to envision things like what if the Lord of the Rings was made in the like Hard Day's Night kind of format? I don't know if that would have been a good thing.
I'm afraid it would be more like Yellow Submarine-ish
Well, yeah,
in
yeah,
tone,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I don't think that necessarily would have. I don't think necessarily would have been great for Tolkien fans. Certainly, I just don't know what it would have been like for people who weren't familiar with Tolkien.
By the same token, George Harrison at least helped fund a bunch of the Monty Python stuff, so
Right?
great patron of the arts in that sense.
Yeah. Okay. Any last thoughts on
No, I think
J.R.R. Tolkien?
I think that it is an interesting. It is for me. It's foundational. It remains such. It's in the the upper pantheon of all these kinds of works. I do think it's a great illustration of some of what we're talking about here, though. How we encountered it as kids, it is in that sense you're kind of in your own head at that point. Maybe you have friends that have read it, but not that many. It is a therefore that experience was very personal, and then over time it's become a popular culture phenomenon beyond just people that have read the books. And I think that's an
Yeah.
interesting evolution for what we're talking about in this podcast.
Yeah.
The sort of
Actually,
themes.
yeah, sorry. I
No,
realized we didn't cover the question, how did you explain your love of Tolkien to other people at the time? And, I think it was easier to explain than some of the other aspects of geekery, like, superhero comics or
well,
Star Trek.
at least a book's respectable. Comic books are for kids, man.
Yeah. That TV show with the cardboard sets and
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
guy overacting.
You know, that's right. I think it is a good question. I know we've talked about it before in other episodes, like with Star Trek in particular.
Hmm.
I think a lot of these things were about finding that handful of other people in your life
Yes.
in school who appreciated it too. And then you probably didn't talk about it a whole lot with people who didn't appreciate it as well. Um, because really, I had a handful of friends who were very passionate about these properties, and then other people had no idea. And I was just the weird kid that carried books everywhere I went, so I had something to read. And it was usually science fiction books in school.
Yeah. Well, we're now weird adults who carry
That's
books
right.
wherever we go. They just happen to be on
That's right.
a device.
Sure. Now that's right. Well,
All right.
Our quest may be completed for this week.
Yes, yes. And we don't need to stretch it out any further.
No, we don't want to do too much Peter Jacksoning of
Yeah.
the rest of this
We
conversation.
don't want to, Peter Jackson's Hobbit
That's
eyes
right.
this podcast.
Indeed not.
Well, that does it for episode 4 of Ancient Geeks. Thanks for listening. Next time, we're going to cover other fantasy writers that were popular during the 60s and 70s, including a lot of sword and sorcery writers. After that, we're also planning on doing our first science fiction episode. You can find the podcast on the podcast service of your choice, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and others. Please subscribe. And more importantly, if you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you have feedback, suggestions, outrage, praise, anything at all you want to communicate to us, contact us at someancientgeeks@gmail.com. Look for us on Facebook, Blue Sky, Reddit, and other social media outlets. We're always grateful for a review on the podcast app of your choice. All content is copyright 2025, Tom Grant and Stephen Taylor. Music by Reversed Image, whom you can find on Pixabay. See you next time.